Gotta go. Yeah, I'll call you back. I'm with that Realtor lady.
In every real estate transaction, something comes up that the buyer or seller may have a question about. But in the heat of the moment, the question goes unanswered. Each episode, I talk with real estate experts and real estate vendors to provide a look at what goes on behind the scenes in the real estate world to get you answers. I blend in local Santa Cruz history, add some tips and tricks, all designed to help you be successful in your next real estate project. Tell your friends you can't talk right now because you are with the Realtor Lady. Real estate is scary. Multiple offers, home inspections, mortgages, or even haunted houses. This is all terrifying, but today we're going to touch on a scarier time in Santa Cruz when Santa Cruz was the murder capital of the world. This is an important time in history for Santa Cruz. We are going to explore why with my guest, Emerson Murray, the author of Murder Capital of the World. Full disclaimer, there will be talk of murder. Some details may be deemed inappropriate for younger audiences. My recommendation is to skip this episode if you find this content to be distasteful, and we will see you next time. That's quite an introduction, isn't it?
Yeah, that's great.
So, welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thanks for having me, Michelle. Yeah, as you said, my name's Emerson, Emerson Murray, and I live in Scotts Valley. I've lived in Santa Cruz County my entire life.
Okay.
My parents are from this area as well. This is my second book that I've written. The first was a biography of a professional wrestler named Bruiser Brody.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
It's
and
quite a span there.
yeah, exactly. Well, that one was pretty gritty as well. Bruiser Brody was murdered in a locker room in Puerto Rico in 1988, and so we sort of dive into the reasons why and mostly his life, though he was an outlaw wrestler, what they call an outlaw wrestler, and yeah,
Do they know who, that's veering off topic, but do they know who
yeah,
murdered him?
yeah, they do. They
Okay.
just don't know why. Yeah, and the trial was sort of a farce. So yeah,
Was the trial in Mexico or in the U.S.?
it was in Puerto Rico. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Puerto Rico.
hmm
Oh, wow. All right. So I have you starting out with the era. You can start wherever's comfortable for you, but I'm just going to kind of let you take
hmm
over, and I'll probably add in all two of my listeners know that I grew up here.
hmm
I came here, I think we came here in 72, 72, 71, 72. I don't know. My mom and her boyfriend at the time decided that was the time to move to Santa Cruz, but
Right.
I did kind of grow up in a real strange time in Santa Cruz. There was just a lot of weird stuff going on as if
Yeah.
that stopped, but I do remember a lot of it actually. So so this particular era or time in Santa Cruz is very interesting to me.
Yeah, so sort of coming out of the fun and wild 60s, things got a little dark in Santa Cruz in the early 70s, if you'll remember. So, sort of the hippie movement sort of turned south in some ways, after the Manson killings in Southern California. The idea and notion of hippies became very dark. And Santa Cruz at the time was a more older conservative retirement place, town, and there were always some surfers here and things like that. But with the changes in the welfare laws, and other reasons, the university opened in 1965, UCSC up on the hill. A lot of youth moved into Santa Cruz, and so it became a little bit of a hotbed here with the antagonism. And a study was done, and it showed that Santa Cruz was unlike any other county where it had a massive population of older folks, and it had a massive population of youth, and not so much, not so many middle-aged folks. And so, with the changes in culture and sort of the, I don't want to say free love, but it was just a wilder youth sort of saying, "Hey, here we are," and this older conservative. It just made for a very hot sort of environment in general in Santa Cruz.
So
And
really
then,
divisive. So you really just have almost just two sides, just no middle.
yeah, exactly. So yeah, there was no moderation. I guess in some ways it's sort of like now, but my understanding was much wild. I mean, you read the newspapers, and it was just a lot of, um, what do I want to say? Just a lot of pushback against the youth and sort of those ideas. So, and at the same time, the Zodiac killer was in the Bay Area, shortly after the Zodiac, and so law enforcement in Santa Cruz was really on edge. And I don't know if you remember, but he had said he was going to like, ambush a school bus and and then shoot the kiddies as they came bouncing off was one of his threats. And so law enforcement was finding themselves having to follow around school buses
Oh my
and things like
gosh.
that. So it was just a hot period of time in general.
Wow. Yeah, I have to explain to people sometimes why there's so many mobile home parks in town. It's like, well, this actually was kind of a retirement town for a
Mm,
while. We had a very large older population for
yeah.
quite a while, and it was this natural progression. You would sell your big house, and then you kind of retire into this, or you would retire from another area into this. That's why we have so many of these parks, but that
Hmm.
people don't really see that. But also, I was going to add in when you um, said between the younger and the older, this was not a kid focused town. There was no kid activities. We just kind of went to school and went home. There was no really. I raised my kids partly in Santa Clara, where everything was about kids. Every weekend, you just go to all these things for kids. And even when we moved back, I think that was like 20 years ago. It's still just not a kid focused town. It's just still really adult centered. And
Yeah.
I still think that's kind of a bleed from that era.
Yeah, I think that's kind of true. That's interesting.
S-
So if I can jump into the book,
Please.
so sort of in the middle of all this heat, in October, we're almost coming up on the 51st anniversary. In October of 1970, a man named John Linley Frazier, who he sort of thought of himself as this, what do I want to say, like like a eco terrorist. He had these ideas that he was going to the rich people were killing the earth, and he was going to get them to burn down their own house, give up all their worldly possessions, and join him in this revolution. And he was going to go from house to house to house and do this. So his first target, he lived in Aptos, and he could see like a mile or a couple miles from where he was living. It was a little milk barn on his mother's property. Up at the top of the hill, he could see the Ohta family building this big, beautiful house. And the Ohtas, which I think a lot of people remember, if they don't remember, they've heard. Dr. Ohta was a very prominent eye surgeon in Santa Cruz. He, I always heard the word prominent, and so I looked it up in the news. Like, why was he so prominent? What exactly does that mean?
Good
Well, he gave
question.
away. He did a lot of surgeries for free, simply if people couldn't pay. And he was also a very good eye surgeon, and his wife was very involved in local clubs and functions and politics. And if you look in the old newspaper, she's in the newspaper more than he is. And they had four children,
Mm.
and they built this home up on the hill. And they really built it in what they called sort of a Japanese style, and that they didn't even cut down a single tree to build that house. There was even like their deck had a tree coming out of it that they left. Like they really built it around nature. John Linley Frazier didn't see it that way, and he was having some mental health issues at that time. Clearly, he had been in an automobile accident here in Scotts Valley, and he started hearing voices in his head. Started He was camping out on top of water towers. Invisible enemies were after him, that kind of thing. So he committed sort of a Manson family style ambush attack on the Ohta family in their home, and killed the Ohta family. The two daughters were out of town, and they survived. And he was caught very shortly after that, and sent to. He actually got the death sentence, but for a short time there, the death sentence was declared unconstitutional, and so he was sentenced. It was commuted to life in prison with the possibility of parole, and so he was up for parole every few years. And then he killed himself in prison in like 2009,
Whoa.
2014, I think. And
Whoa.
then, hot on the heels of that, and actually while he was sort of going to trial, there were two serial killers in Santa Cruz at the same time, operating at the same time. And one was Herbert Mullin. Herbert Mullin was a local kid. He went
Mhm.
to San Lorenzo Valley High School, class of 1965. And his family lived in Felton, and he lived with them for a while and sort of moved around Santa Cruz. Another one with very bad mental health conditions. And at that time, for whatever reason, a lot of the mental health in California was being defunded by our governor and by this state. His family desperately tried to get him into facilities, and it never took, and he always left. So he started what what you call like a murder spree. Serial killer wasn't a term at that time. So he started a murder spree, and he ultimately killed 13 people and was caught in February 1973. And then also at the same time was a man named Edmund Kemper. He had killed his grandparents when he was 15 years old, and went to a Atascadero mental hospital and the CYA, and at Atascadero they evaluated him, and they said, okay, at 21 we need to release him, but we found that sort of the instigating factor in this crime was his mother. So under no conditions should he be released to the custody of his mother. Well, then he moves to the California Youth Authority, CYA, and they unfortunately said, we are remanding you to the custody of your mother. So he went and lived with his mother, and then shortly after that, he started picking up hitchhikers and killed 6 women hitchhikers in Santa Cruz. And then he ultimately did kill his mother and one of her friends and turn himself in to law enforcement. And both Mullin and Kemper are still alive and
Hmm.
in prison.
Was
That's
Mullin
sort of
as crafty as Kemper? I think Kemper was very charming
Kemper
and
was,
very
yeah,
smart.
yeah. By all accounts, he was very smart, very high IQ. But he was, like you said, yeah, he was crafty, and he took sort of, what do I want to say? He took murder very seriously, and was sneaky about it. He had his murder clothes with dark outfit. He had what he called his murder car, and in the car he had a lever to open the door. And when passengers would get in, well, first he'd pick up, pull over for a hitchhiker, and he'd say, "Oh, where are you going?" They'd tell him, and he would make a point to look at his watch. I guess I have time. Just that little things like that to make people at ease. And they'd get in, and he'd say, "Oh, is that door closed?" And reach over, and he'd drop a chapstick in the lever so the door wouldn't be able to open, and they'd essentially be trapped.
Mm.
And as many people know, Kemper was 6'9". He was massive, and these women didn't stand a chance. So, and Mullin was not so crafty. Mullin had mental health issues. He says that he believed at the time that um, only through human sacrifice could we prevent a natural disaster. He was deeply afraid that California was going to have a massive earthquake and slide into the ocean, and the Vietnam War was sort of winding down. So the only way to prevent that was to up the murder rate, and he took it on upon himself. Hey, I'm going to be this what he called a sadist, and I'm going to save California by killing people. And he would do it out in the open. He was caught, in Santa Cruz, just shooting out somebody out of the back of his car, broad daylight, middle of the street, literally middle of the street.
Where was that?
That was, oh man, I forgot the address, but it was over off of Mission Street, and with all those houses over there, not quite by the circle, but sort of behind. Um, I don't know, those businesses down there change so often, but yeah, it's in the middle of the street. It was a man named John Paris, or the son is named John Paris, sorry. Um, and he was out filling in a pothole by his house in the street, or right next to the street by a telephone pole. And Mullin drove past him and pulled over. And he had one of those old station wagons where the back would roll down. He had a bunch of firewood in the back, and he leaned over the firewood out the back and with a rifle, and just shot him in the middle of the street. And right across the street was a woman named Joan Stagnero. I think a lot of people know the Stagnero family.
Yes.
And she heard it and looked out her window, and there's a guy with a rifle. And so she immediately called 911. And the guy with the rifle zipped off, and her 2 sons went out and to be with the victim as he passed away. And she called in to describe the car, and Mullin went up to Mission Street. He turned right. He went into a business parking lot to sort of calm himself or whatever, and then he went down Mission towards Santa Cruz, hit River Road or
River
Highway
Street.
9. or River Street, yeah,
Mhm.
and turned left to go to Felton, and he was pulled over there right in front of sort of Saul's Tannery or the
Mhm.
rockery place there, and his murder spree was effectively over at that point. I mean, they had him dead to rights.
And he was just crazy. So we have Frazier kind of thinks he's saving the world.
Hmm.
Kemper's just crazy from his mom, and then Mullin's just nuts. That's just kind of
Yeah,
the reason I bring that up only is because I think that the kind of the free love era and things kind of switching so radically, uh, kind of playing out in Santa Cruz. I mean, the amount of weirdos I encountered walking home from school on Mission Street and on
right.
California Street, and how glowingly or happily they felt it was okay to talk to a little girl. Like
Yeah,
somehow they thought that was okay. And I don't know where these ideologies change of where we have to, be so rigid in our uh culture to then we can just do whatever we want. But
right.
but also my huge rant, and you're gonna be towed behind my truck of this rant, but my rant is where Santa Cruz at some point became kind of a lawless area for some reason. And I really think this is a contributor. I think
Yeah,
this is in the back of a lot of people's minds, even if they don't have that, if they don't know all these exact facts. They just have this, oh, yeah, we can go there. I mean, each weekend I follow the Santa Cruz City Police on Twitter, and every Sunday and Monday morning, they are showing some arrest of somebody who's come from out of the area to come here to
hmm,
do drugs and crime. Like, let's just go there to do it.
right,
And I
right.
kind of feel like these guys are responsible.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, the law enforcement that I talked to, they said that Santa Cruz was always known as a dumping ground for bodies for crimes committed all over the Bay Area. It was just a known thing. And both of the Kemper and Mullin's crime scenes sort of started that way. They were just finding bodies uh, around. The Kemper's first victims were actually from the Berkeley area, and Mullin he had killed a homeless man side of the road, and seemingly out of nowhere, obviously. So these bodies just started appearing. Well, that was in line with what had always happened. And if you read the book, um, there are were I go over some of the other crimes. There were other crimes and bodies found around Santa Cruz. And then the other thing is that people today forget is the hitchhiking and hitchhiking culture. I mean,
Yeah.
if you remember, every on ramp to the freeway, there's people there with their thumbs out, and back in those days, and I can remember that, and everyone I talked to was like, "Oh yeah, we'd pick up hitchhike." Not everyone, but we'd pick
Yeah.
up hitchhikers, or I hitchhiked myself. And people living in the San Lorenzo Valley before the bus system, they were kids, and they said, "Oh yeah, we used to hitchhike and have races to get to Santa Cruz quickest, in the fewest amount of rides." And
Well,
it's just and Peter, here's another thing: the district attorney Peter Chang at the time, his name was Peter Chang. He has this great quote, and he said that Santa Cruz is unlike most other cities in that you can be in a downtown, bustling area, and within 3 to 5 minutes, be out in the woods, completely isolated. Nobody can hear a sound. So that's another reason I think that this place was sort of chosen, or it just makes it ripe for those kind of crimes.
that that's that's it in a nutshell. Yeah, I was talking to a client yesterday, and I told him about recording this today, and he said, "Well, that's because they were dumping bodies in the mountains." And I was like, "What?" That's the first time I'd ever heard of that.
Yeah.
That is insane. I actually also showed the Otz house as I showed it to buyers. It was for sale 2 years ago.
Hmm.
I think it's pretty original. It's a nice house. I thought it was very respectful of the environment.
Yeah.
And it wasn't haunted. There was nothing like that. But what I thought was
Right.
interesting is that the home had a book in it that had the history of the family, but everybody knew. It was like this hanging thing about the property that everybody knew that had happened.
Interesting.
The buyers
If you
weren't concerned about it too much. It just wasn't for them.
Yeah, if you go online, you can find a history of it. It was built by a man named Aaron Green, and he was the only sort of protege of Frank Lloyd Wright. So it has some prominence to it, and it's the second largest house that he built. And they built it, yeah, not just with the Japanese, sort of. aspect in mind, like they said, of respect for nature, but my understanding is it has some sort of Japanese features to it. And at that website, it lists that there've only been like two sort of renovations at all, and I forgot what the first one was. The second one, it says, "Oh, was because of a fire in 1970." Because after John Linley Frazier murdered the Ohta family, he tried to light the kitchen on fire. He started, I think, 5 or 7 little fires in the kitchen, and the kitchen went up in flames, but it didn't impact the rest of the house. So,
Yeah, I remember the kitchen being newer.
yeah, interesting. Yeah.
All right. Wow, we just kind of zipped through that. What other do you I did not read the book yet, of course. So
hmm
what else do you touch on in the book that's you haven't?
Well, yeah, so I sort of go over, like I said, hitchhiking and other crimes in the area. But another big aspect, which I sort of touched on before, was sort of the hippies and the antagonism between the locals and the hippies, who in the end, ended up being sort of the kids of the locals. But um, there was a commune in Ben Lomond by Highlands Park named the Holiday Commune. My dad lived there for a while. Another man named Jim Genera lived there for a while. He was a high school friend of Herbert Mullin, and would end up being, he and his wife, one of Herbert Mullin's victims. Um,
He and his wife?
yeah, yeah,
Oh.
were killed by Mullin over
Hmm.
what's the street down off of UCSC? I forgot the street. The house is still there though. It's a neat looking house. Um, but yeah, so the holiday cabins, yeah, that was a big sort of hippie commune, and locals absolutely detested it. They tried to Molotov cocktail the bus. It was my dad's bus. It didn't go up because Coke bottles at that time were very thick glass. So, um, uh, yeah, so I go over that quite a bit in the book. Just that antagonism, and in the end, Santa Cruz Board of Supervisors asked this company, I can't remember their name, to sort of to do a report on what they call the Utes, the undesirable transient element. What's going on with Santa Cruz? Why do we have all these Utes? And so they conducted this report, and they're the ones that sort of had discovered, hey, all this youth and all these older folks. And they said, sure, Santa Cruz has a lot of surfers, and there is some hippie element, but they're just doing marijuana and LSD. They said the harder drugs that everybody was so concerned that were coming into Santa Cruz at the time, they said were being sold and distributed by people in suits. And so that, yeah, so they said this desire, and they also said this undesirable transient element. It's your kids, it's this youth movement. The people aren't. Some people are coming in the area, but a lot of them are local as well. So that did not go over well, and then the company said, oh, and we can also we can further study this for 15 or $45,000 or something like that if you
Mm.
want. And the board of supervisors was not happy with their findings. So shortly after that, the idea of becoming a Ute, UTE, undesirable transient element, became kind of trendy and popular. And there was a man named Pat Lickey who started this Ute. He made T-shirts, saying Ute, undesirable transient element, and tote bags and flags, and proud to be a Ute, that kind of thing. And that sort of took off, and ultimately, Pat ended up becoming. He was elected to be on the board of supervisors. He became a supervisor, and they in the newspaper they call him the hippie mayor, Pat Lickey. And I knew Pat, and I was a little kid, but he was certainly not like an out and out hippie by any means. So that was sort of funny. Like they had put a spotlight on this issue, and then the issue sort of ended up encompassing them or enveloping them, and so just sort of an interesting
It is.
backstory. Yeah.
I, that also might give a little rise to why homeless feel comfortable coming here. That
hmm
history of that. Why did you write this book?
So I wrote the book. This story has just sort of been with me pretty much my whole life. Like we knew growing up, my brother and I, that our dad's friend Jim had been killed by Herbert Mullin. We just knew it, and we talked about it sort of openly in the house. That may sound morbid, but it was just a fact. My dad had a picture of himself and Jim and their friend Mouse hiking, and it was just there, in and around us, and we talked about it. And you're from there, so like some people just talk. I mean, I can go to a bookstore. I was just in Two Birds bookstore on 41st, dropping off some books, and there was a customer in there and said, "Oh yeah, my girlfriend's or wife's dad was in law enforcement at that time, and everywhere you go, somebody has a story. I could walk down to Nob Hill and say, "Hey, John Linley Frazier, Herbert Mullin, somebody will have a story locally." So I just knew this, and so when I was always attracted to that darker side, I guess. So I started saving newspaper clippings, and anytime every 10 years something would come up or somebody would go on parole, one of the killers, I would just clip it and save it, and it was always in the back of my head, like, man, this would make a great sort of TV show or movie or something. And I had a coworker, we used to talk back and forth and about, oh man, somebody's got to do a TV show about this. And um and then in 2000, so that was just always there. And in 2019 I went and saw Mickey Alufi speak, and he was one of the detectives, primarily working on the Kemper case, but they were killing at the same time, so it went sort of back and forth. But he was primarily working on the Kemper case, and um, he gave a talk about Kemper, about Edmund Kemper, and my wife and I went and saw it. And Mickey's super sharp, like he just remembers the facts, and he was a great help on my book. But he, we looked around when we got there, and he's giving the talk, and everybody is like in their 80s, And I thought, man, within 10, 20 years, we're not going to have this primary source material, meaning these people and their stories, and that actually live through this. It's just going to be gone as their memories go, and unfortunately, people pass away. So that was like a Saturday, and on Monday, I was sitting in my office just looking out the window. I was like, I have to do something, and like I said, I had already written that book before, about Bruiser Brody. So I was like, I'm writing a book. And I remember one of my coworkers walking in, and I was like, I'm writing a book. What are you talking about? I said, I've been thinking about this for almost my whole life. So
I'm writing a book.
I was like, yeah. So that night I immediately started calling people, and, you know, and of course the first people I called, my parents, they were there. My dad knew Jim, and so uh, and then it's like I always describe it sort of a spider web. You talk to one person, they're like, oh, you got to talk to so and so and so and so. Great, what's their phone number and all that. So I it just sort of spider webbed out, And my mom put me in touch with our old family friend, Bob Ludlow, and Bob knows everybody in Santa Cruz. So then Bob spins me off to Sam Robustelli and Harold Cartwright and Austin Comstock, all these local people that worked on the cases and stuff. And so I always felt like if the person was involved in a professional way with these crimes, then, as an investigator or an attorney or something, I felt comfortable calling them on the phone and just say, hey, I'm working on this book. My name's Emerson. But if it was like a victim's family member or
Yeah.
friend or something,
Yeah.
I typically wrote a letter. I went old school. I thought it might be a little softer, and give them a chance. They can call me if they want to. And a lot did. And that was very up and down. A lot of some people were just didn't respond, and others were, how dare you even bring this up? And that was tough. I've tried to be as respectful as I could, because the book is really ultimately about the victims. Each chapter is a victim, and I try to tell their story. And um, and some were just very happy to talk to me. When I talked to Mary Guilfoyle, was Mullin's second victim, and when I talked to her sister-in-law, she was happy to talk to me, and she even said, thank you so much for doing this, because we've seen documentaries about the killer and books about the killer, but no one has ever asked us about Mary. And so she was amazed. This lady was amazing, and she sent me pictures of Mary, which nobody had ever seen, obviously, and told me some really neat stories about who Mary was as a person and her life. And 'cause a lot of these people were young; they didn't have long lives, obviously, and so it was just neat to. That's what I'm most proud of with the book. It's just getting these stories out there about who the people were, because I see so many books and projects that are like the killer is a rock star, kind of. They kind of treat him that way.
Yeah.
It's frustrating and sick, and makes me kind of always made me mad. And you can't get away from the killer, obviously, if you're doing a book, but like the victims are important. I mean, that I
Yeah.
don't know. That's just how I always
Well, I
felt.
think true
So
crime is really changing. I think the focus has really gone off of the killers. I think that the victims are playing more of a part. I think it's been
yeah,
nice that the media has downplayed these guys and talked
yeah,
more about the victims. And I think one of the headlines that always grabs me and drives me crazy is as it'll always say like at least 250 people killed. Well, what are we going for more? I mean, there's
yeah,
still a
yeah,
lot of work to be done and how to get people to understand the loss of life.
yeah.
We're not even close.
I agree with that. Yeah, a lot of times it comes out like a score, like a
Yeah.
video game score or
Yeah.
something,
Yeah.
and that's bothersome. Even at the beginning of this, I was talking about, Mullin killed 13 and Kemper killed 6. Like, in some ways, it's sort of, it doesn't belittle, but it's hard. This it's not callous, but you just sometimes. I mean, it is what it is. I guess I'm not exactly sure what I'm trying to say, but you just have to keep your mind on them at all time because they were people, and even Jim, Genera has a daughter who's still in the area, and I wrote her a letter, and I just wanted to tell her, like, I felt like it would be horrible for her to walk into a bookstore and just see this book. So I just said I don't really. She was a baby at the time, so I don't need anything unless you want to talk. But I just didn't want you to walk into a bookstore or hear about this somehow and be like, "What the heck is this?" Without some kind of heads up. I just felt like that was really important. And uh, another interesting aspect was that these killers had families who, in a
Hmm.
twisted way, were victims as well. They didn't ask for this attention or on their family or themselves.
Notoriety.
And yeah, so I reached out. Mullin has a sister. She had moved out before they even moved. That family had moved to Felton, was married. She never got back to me, and Kemper's sister is still around. His younger sister is still around. I wrote her a letter, and I tried to call her, but she did not want to talk. And I thought that's fine. You know, I tried to tell her, like, I really want to hear about your mom because all we knew at the time about Kemper's mother was from Kemper, and of course was not a glowing picture. It was a really nasty sort of picture of the mom. And I thought, well, she's a person. Let's hear the other side. And I did eventually get the other side. I talked to some of her coworkers. She worked at UCSC, so I talked to a couple of her coworkers, and I did find recordings of Kemper's sister and his two sisters, and they both talked about her. So you get a good sense in the book of who Kemper's mother was, and because it's very skewed when you just hear it from Kemper, clearly. So.
Right. Well, everybody has an opinion about their parents.
Hmm.
But a lot of people don't normally share. The other part of this, and do you touch upon it on the book at all, is just kind of that shift in time, like how we go from the 60s to the 70s, and
Yep.
because that's
Yep.
really important as well. I mean, I'm not downplaying the victim's experience and that
Hmm.
but I'm also it's it's a marker. It's a clear-cut marker of where things just radically changed.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And yeah, I do touch on that a lot. There's a Santa Cruz, I mean, there's a chapter just about Santa Cruz, and also a chapter, with the history of, and, going over who Peter Chang is, and that's another thing, is nobody ever asked about who's Peter Chang, who's Harold Cartwright, who are these people that were, to me, sort of legends in Santa Cruz, like that. Those are our sort of little local celebrities from that time period. And so that was, and Jim Jackson, he was the public defender who defended all three of the killers. and
Whoa.
and he's just such an amazing person, such an original thinker, and it was just a lot, ended up being a lot of fun talking to him, and just hearing his opinions about things. But and they're so respectful about each other, but yet they have these completely different views. Chris Cottle, who was an assistant to the district attorney, and he became district attorney later. He had these points of view on Mullin and Kemper and Frazier, and then you talk to Jim Jackson, the public defender, or Harold Cartwright, who's an investigator for the public defender, and, and they're respectful of each other, but their opinions are completely different. Like, no, he was not uh, insane by the Manhattan standard, which is how we judge whether you are legally insane or not. And then you talk to the defense, and oh, he was sure, he was sort of organized, but he was clearly insane in by legal definition. So um, that
So
was
with
really cool.
Peter Chang, a prosecutor,
Yeah, yeah. So he was the prosecutor
and
on
they
all
were
three.
all
Well,
three tried here.
yeah. Well, the Frazier trial was moved over to Redwood City, so that was held over there. But it was like a local jury, and it was all our folks, the public defender and the district attorney. They all went over there. And funny enough, they all stayed in the same hotel, which you'd never see nowadays. They all stayed in the same hotel and were hosting parties with each other.
Oh my.
Um, and my understanding is even after the trial, the district attorney threw a party and the jurors were at the party. So, and the defense, so it's just different times. It's sort of like the hitchhiking thing. It's hard to get your head around when if you're living through this era, just how different it was in a lot of ways, and informal things were, which was not to the betterment of a lot of people, women and minorities and stuff. But that's just the way it was at the time. So
Peter Chang, he passed away, right? He's not around anymore.
yeah,
Right?
so a lot of the stories that I whenever I'd ask about Peter Chang, the people that knew him, they'd tell me how great he was and how smart he was. And he was an amazing trial lawyer, by my understanding. Was from La Selva Beach. He had worked in the Monterey, a district attorney's office down there, and he tried a lot of cases of murder from Soledad, of prisoners killing other prisoners. So he had a lot of trial experience. But eventually, every person I talked to eventually brought up how much he drank. So
Mm.
he was, and he talked about it a lot himself, because later he ran to be a judge. I can't remember what circuit, but it was here locally, and he brought up a lot about his alcoholism and how what he had lost his family over it. He had just lost so much, lost his law practice over it, and was really trying to rebuild. And he that bid was not successful. He did not become a judge, and I think he ultimately died of alcohol-related diseases. I can't remember
I
what
think he
year it
did.
was.
I seem to recall that. I still read the paper version of the Sentinel.
Hmm.
When I was a teenager, I read it purely for entertainment because the grammar was so bad. It used to crack me
Oh,
up.
how funny!
It's
That's
just
funny.
poorly written. But they were the stars for sure. These guys were still, yeah, when I was a teenager. Yeah. But
People also forget about the Register Pajaronian, which mine is still around as a weekly,
is it? Okay.
but it was a daily newspaper. It was very well known. There was a woman named Marg von B who was a reporter for them, and everybody I talked to that worked on the case, legal terms or law firm, they just loved Marge. I guess she had this gravelly voice and it was a smoker and saying, "What do you got for me? And is this on the record or off the record?"
Oh my gosh.
And she actually got to know Kemper a little bit while he'd be waiting in the hallway or waiting to go into court, all shackled. She would talk with him, and ultimately he granted her an interview. So it was in some true crime magazine that was later published, and she interviewed him. But she was very well known. I think I can't remember what she had won, but she had won awards for her journalism, and somehow she settled in I guess in Watsonville and with that newspaper. It's sort of interesting.
Yeah. The newspapers used to be something.
Yeah, it used to be very different, right?
Yeah, I still like it, but it's not the same.
Yeah, yeah. And the title of the book, it came from Mullin had killed 4 boys that were camping. They had built sort of a makeshift tent. It's like almost like it looked like a yurt sort of, but it had like different chambers. I mean, it was huge out in Henry Cowell
Mm.
Forest in a remote part that nobody was really supposed to be in. And Mullin, of course, he said he was saving the earth, but curiously enough, he had been sort of building a tent, and the Rangers found him a few years earlier and kicked him out. And so he sees these 4 boys out there with a tent, and by his account, they psychically told him, like, yes, we need to be sacrifices, and we're going to save the world. He goes into the tent, and shoots all 4 of them, and kills them. Well, the next day or later that day, um, Peter Chang is giving a press conference about it, and a San Francisco Examiner reporter asks him and says, "So, Santa Cruz at this time must be the murder capital of the world, right?" And Peter Chang said, "Yeah, we think we are the murder capital." And that just took off, and that was in all the newspapers and and I found and it stuck, of course. And I found in the newspapers at the time the board of supervisors just hated it, especially Pat Lickey, that they were talking about in their meetings. Who named us this? This isn't true. And I think they were worried about sort of your aspect. The real estate would go down, and the tourism would go down once we got this reputation. But and it stuck. And even in 1987, when they made the Lost Boys movie, which they shot here and in Santa Cruz, they renamed it Santa Carla, as in the beginning of the movie when the protagonist and his mom and his brother are driving into town, and you see this big billboard and it says "Welcome to Santa Carla," and then they pass by. The camera lingers and it pan, or, pans over to the back of the sign, and in big red and black letters says "Murder Capital of the World." Somebody had graffitied on it, and it's like they filmed it here and they took that out of, like, yeah, that is us. And I always tell people, like, that Santa Carla, they only had a handful, a little coven of teenage vampires. We had this 6'9", like cannibal, necrophile cannibal, and we had this guy murdering people for the earthquake. Like, give me a handful of teenage vampires any day. We had it much worse than what they put in the movies. So
I don't know. A lot of the extras were my friends. They're
that's
pretty
funny.
nutty too.
Yeah,
They didn't kill anybody, but
right.
definitely we were huge terrors in town.
That's funny.
Yeah, that I tried to watch it. I couldn't. It's just so dumb.
Oh, that's funny.
I think we did watch a part of it. I was like, oh, there's so and so, but
Yeah, I grew up with it, so I just loved it. I always loved that. Yeah, that's funny.
yeah, different time. I get really defensive about Santa Cruz, and when people say things about it, it's just like if you even just took a bit of history or even understood the background of some of the stuff that has gone on here, you would understand that you're wrong. I mean,
Yeah,
basically, you're wrong. I don't have a lot of complaints about Santa Cruz, although I should, for whatever comes up politically or culturally. But this kind of stuff I think is important because it really does. It does stick in the back of people's minds. It is something. There's always kind of that scary element. I don't know about the rest of people on my street, but my door is always locked. It's just always locked. Home or not or whatever, everything is always completely locked. I think that's just kind of the way I grew up. I gave up worrying about what's in my car. Either I take it out or I give it away because they're going to get into the car.
Right.
Other than that, I
And
feel safe. But I
yeah,
also did happen upon some crime statistics lately, which is really awful. So I'm probably not going to go back and
interesting.
look at that.
Yeah, and and this essentially killed hitchhiking.
Yeah.
Everyone stopped hitchhiking after this.
Which not
Uh,
in a way, I mean, if you think about it, for all the women who were probably assaulted, didn't feel like the cops or anybody were going to do anything about it, that might have had I'm just going to say a slight good piece to that. I think there was a lot of, because it
yeah,
was,
that's an interesting point. Like, yeah, how can something really, really negative sort of help society change? And that's a really good point. And the other thing is the women's lib movement was happening around that time, and so women were like, "I want my own darn driver's license. Like, I can drive a car." Like, so there were some positive things, and that helped shove it along, maybe in some sick way. I don't know, like, but it's just it was just such a time of change, and people, I always point to the late '60s, but the early '70s, we were still changing, and we were sort of, I don't know. It was just a rough time. It's funny now because now we just, type in Uber and get picked up by a stranger.
you
So,
get in a
but
stranger's car for sure.
yeah, so it's sort of funny. I mean, there's controls around it, obviously, but some things change and some things don't. So,
I was walking along with my mom. I think I was like 8 years old. So that would have made me, what was that, like 76-ish or so? And me and my mom were walking down the street and she was holding my hand and some guy pulled up on Mission Street and just said, so like, hey, where's the party? Like we were together. And, that sticks out in my mind. And then we had other men try to get us in their cars over the years as we were young kids. And
yeah,
um, I think that whole idea of, and I'm glad that's gone away. And I think actually this probably did help because there was more stranger danger stuff starting to come along. And when people say, oh, the strangers were, out there, well, they're out there. Of course, some of them were in my own family. They were bad people too. But this is such an era where we actually started looking at, and how many people were really doing bad stuff. How many people thought they were going to get caught? and they were
Right,
doing
right, yeah.
something right. Oh, they're going to come get
Yeah,
me next and nothing happened. I mean, you got to think about that, which is scary to think about.
yeah. And your business, when you're showing houses to people from outside the area, did they ever bring up this kind of stuff?
No, I didn't know it. We were going to see the Otz House, and I'm not aware of
Hmm.
where all the houses are. So my
Hmm.
buyer wanted to see it, and I have a feeling he wanted to see it because of that, but he never
Yeah,
really
yeah.
admitted it. Um, I I think people have a really yeah, people have an idea about Santa Cruz that I will spend time. I spend time on my YouTube channel trying to just spell some of it, and I do when I'm
Hmm.
with people of you know Santa Cruz has done a lot for the world as well. I mean, it's not like we've
Right,
produced these
right, for
serial
sure.
killers. I mean, there's a lot of
Hmm.
people in Santa Cruz that have gone on to do a lot of good in the whole world, and try to bring that up.
Hmm. Hmm.
I don't actually believe in haunted houses,
Hmm.
but there's been vibes during the foreclosure era when people were literally forced out of their homes. Well, I mean, they probably had no business buying that home anyway, but there would usually be a eerie linger. Uh, but other than that, I haven't really come across. I didn't think when we were in the Otis house there was anything eerie there, but
Yeah, yeah. Maybe it's been purged, or maybe that stuff doesn't exist at all. Yeah, it's just I think people bring a lot of baggage with them in a lot of cases, and so it's I mean, I've seen and heard stories that are unexplainable, but I think people bring a lot of what's inside them to things. And
you are
it's sort of
absolutely
interesting.
right. I moved out of my last house and I heard voices for a long time. My husband heard them at one point too, and when we moved out and we sold it, I just told him I think we were actually just being told by something to move because we had lived there
Hmm.
too long and that was no longer the space for us because the new owner has not said a word. He's fine, loves the house.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
and it was just a matter of yeah, exactly what you say. It was our time to move and we weren't listening to whatever, you know, thing we
yeah,
were
yeah.
supposed to
Interesting.
Cosmo we were supposed to listen to.
Hmm.
Well, I really appreciate you having you on and
Yeah, thank you.
are you going to how long has your book been out? I just found it. So.
So, yeah, it came out. It just came out in July. Where are we at?
Oh,
October,
okay.
July. Yeah, so it's pretty new. I did a limited edition of 1,000. Each one is hand numbered and hand signed. I got pallets of them out in the garage behind me. Yeah, so the 3,002 pounds of books were delivered. Um, and you can get it at Two Birds Bookstore on 41st Avenue, and you can get it at Bookshop Santa Cruz, and Postal Annex in Scotts Valley, and then murdercapitaloftheworld.com, CAPITAL, and then that's ordering directly from me,
Okay.
and yep, so that's how you can get it.
Are you going to be doing any signings or
Well, I did a talk for the Rotary Club. I've done a couple of podcasts and stuff, but like Bookshop Santa Cruz and Two Birds, I talked to them, and both of them are like, we're not ready with COVID. We're not ready to have live book events yet. So I'm excited to do that. That was one of my strange, weird goals for myself. Is I would love to do a talk at Bookshop Santa Cruz because I've seen so many wonderful authors speak there myself. Um, so that I would love to do that. I spoke, like I said, at a Rotary Club, and I'm going to do another Rotary Club in San Jose later this month. Um, there's not just not a lot of live stuff. I've thought about doing sort of a Facebook stream or something, but I don't know.
yeah,
But if you go to the website, you can see where to order the book, and there's a Facebook group that I started, and it's got like almost 500 members, so that's kind of
yeah. Yeah, and you'll get a copy of the podcast too. So if you want to throw that around, you
oh
can.
cool. Yeah, I'll throw it up there on all the social media.
Okay. I'm going to say goodbye and thank you, but don't turn off your screen yet. And thank you so much for humoring me. This is a bonus, but it's also I mean, the whole idea of me doing content is for people to get to know me a little bit. I do like true crime, but I'm actually more interested in Santa Cruz. So I think we touched on a lot of Santa Cruz. So for that,
I
I
think you
thank
would like
you.
the book then. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yours might be the first real true crime Santa Cruz book that I've read. I've kind of danced around them. I think it's a little too close to home. I've read other ones, but I'm like, I don't know. I think I'm a little nervous.
Well, I'll tell you this, I sort of haunted myself everywhere I go in Santa Cruz now. I'm like, oh, that's where Kemper did this. Oh, that's where he met his friend after he killed him. Everywhere I go now, I've
See?
sort of, like
It
I
kind of
said,
put that
haunted
lens over
myself.
everything.
Yeah, so that's been sort of tough. And my family's been great. My wife and two kids, I just drag them out to these weird locations to take pictures and stuff. And they're like, okay, fine, let's go. It's just wild.
And I appreciate you not mentioning addresses and just keeping
Yeah.
it to local areas,
No
because
details. Yeah,
definitely
keep the
don't want to
gore
drag
out of it.
people through because I believe Kemper's place was up for sale a couple years ago as well, and that was getting activity just for that.
Yeah, of course.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
Thanks.